Very warm welcome to you all today. I know this is quite a last-minute event, as it tends to be with these high-level speakers, so really great to see such a full room. I'm Clara from the events team. You'll notice that I'm wearing a blue lanyard, so that is the way to tell who is Chatterton House staff member. So if you need anything during the event, please don't hesitate to get in touch. If the fire alarm goes off, which I'm sure it won't, but just in case, the nearest exits are over here and over here. I'd be grateful if you could keep any bags kind of away from the aisles. We have mic runners running around, so we don't want them to trip. I'm sure all of your phones are not off silent, but in case they are, please put your phones on silent and enjoy the event. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us here on BBC News. You're seeing images live from Chatham House in central London, where we're expecting to hear from the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. He is due to be giving a speech where he will talk about the need for NATO members to vastly increase their spending on air and missile defences. He has arrived at number 10 Downing Street already to meet with Sir Keir Starmer, but what he will be talking about in his speech is, what we're expecting to hear is that he will push for NATO members to boost spending to what is 3.5% of their GDP and to commit to a lot further than that. So that is what we're expecting him to be able to say in his speech, and he will talk about the importance of that increase in spending as a means of NATO staying credible in terms of its deterrence and defence. Specifically, he is saying that NATO needs a 400% increase in air and missile defence. So that is what we're expecting to hear from the Secretary-General of NATO, Mark Rutte, when he arrives and takes to the podium. And we have, of course, heard from the UK in terms of the defence review, where there was the message put out that spending is due to increase anyway in terms of a percentage of GDP. But this is going beyond that. This is calling for a much higher increase in defence spending. So let's see if we can listen in now to what will be said by the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte when he arrives here at Chatham House.
About to make that keynote speech. He has just taken his seat. I don't think we are that far away. The introduction's currently being made, and we will carry that speech live here on BBC News here. And it will be interesting because, of course, he has been talking about a 400% increase in air missile defences, and the other critical area, that push to try to get NATO countries to 5%. Let's bring in Ed Arnold, who is waiting to talk to us, Senior Fellow for European Security at the UK Defence think tank RUSI. Ed, welcome here to the programme. Just a quick assessment before Mark Rutte gets going. The key things you're listening out for today?
Well, key will be the defence spending commitments that are going to hopefully be agreed at the Hague summit in 2 weeks' time. Really important in terms of increasing defence expenditure across the board in all NATO countries, and then also in terms of more detail on how much he's looking to increase expenditure on these regional plans. Yes, the 400% on integrated air and missile defence, which is a key ability for Europe.
Ed, apologies to cut across you, but we're looking at the live pictures and Mark Rutte at the microphones, so let's put the sound up.
Think tanks on international affairs, so it's a real honor to be here. It has been producing influential ideas for more than a century. And this is the place where I want to share the plan to build a better NATO. This plan will be at the heart of our summit in The Hague. I want to thank the United Kingdom for more than 7 decades of continuous commitment to NATO. It makes vital contributions to our shared security. The British Army leads NATO's multinational force in Estonia. RAF jets are patrolling over Poland's skies as part of NATO's air policing mission. NATO's Maritime Command in Northwood directs our naval operations, and Royal Navy ships protect the seas. With a NATO-first policy at its core, I also warmly welcome the UK's new strategic defence review. It will strengthen and modernise Britain's armed forces and enhance NATO's collective defence. Commitment has a cost, and I welcome that the UK government will spend significantly more on defence in the future. I know we can count on the United Kingdom as we start the next chapter for NATO. In just 2 weeks, I will chair the NATO summit of allied leaders in The Hague. And this summit will transform our alliance. We will build a better NATO, one that is stronger, fairer and more lethal, so that we can continue to keep our people safe and our adversaries at bay. Because of Russia, war has returned to Europe. We also face the threat of terrorism and fierce global competition. Russia has teamed up with China, North Korea and Iran. They are expanding their militaries and their capabilities. Putin's war machine is speeding up, not slowing down. Russia is reconstituting its forces with Chinese technology and producing more weapons faster than we thought. In terms of ammunition, Russia produces in 3 months what the whole of NATO produces in a year. And its defense industrial base is expected to roll out 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armored vehicles and 200 Iskander missiles this year alone. Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. 5 years. Let's not kid ourselves. We are all on the eastern flank now. The new generation of Russian missiles travel at many times the speed of sound. The distance between European capitals is only a matter of minutes. There is no longer East or West. There is just NATO. China is also modernizing and expanding its military at breakneck speed. It already has the world's largest navy. And its battle force is expected to grow to 435 ships by 2030. China is also building up its nuclear arsenal. And it aims to have more than 1,000 operational nuclear warheads also by 2030. Those who stand against freedom and democracy are digging in, preparing for long-term confrontation and trying to dominate and divide us. In 1936, Winston Churchill posed this question during a debate in the House of Commons. Will there be time to put our defenses in order? Will there be time to make these necessary efforts? Or will the awful words, "too late," be recorded? And that is the question for NATO now. History has taught us that to preserve peace, we must prepare for war. Wishful thinking will not keep us safe. We cannot dream away the danger. Hope is not a strategy. So NATO has to become a stronger, fairer and more lethal alliance. A stronger NATO means spending much more on our defense. All allies will reach the initial target of spending 2% of GDP on defense this year. That was a pledge made way back in 2014. Now we have a concrete plan for the future. We know what we need, and we know what to do. At the summit in The Hague, I expect allied leaders will agree to spend 5% of GDP on defense. It will be a NATO-wide commitment and a defining moment for the alliance. There are 2 parts to this new defense spending plan. 3.5% will be invested in our core military requirements, while the rest will go towards defense and security-related investments, including infrastructure and building industrial capacity. 5% is not some figure plucked from the air. It's grounded in hard facts. The fact is, we need a quantum leap in our collective defense. The fact is, we must have more forces and capabilities to implement our defense plans in full. The fact is, danger will not disappear, even when the war in Ukraine ends. Our decisions on defense spending are driven by NATO's battle plans and capability targets. They define what forces and capabilities allies need to provide. And last week, NATO defense ministers agreed ambitious new targets. The exact details are classified, but we need a 400% increase in air and missile defense, We see in Ukraine how Russia delivers terror from above. So we will strengthen the shield that protects our skies. Our militaries also need thousands more armored vehicles and tanks, millions more artillery shells. And we must double our enabling capabilities, such as logistics, supply, transportation, and medical support. Allies will invest in more warships and aircraft. To give just one example, America's allies will procure at least 700 F-35 fighter jets in total. We will also invest in more drones and long-range missile systems, and invest more in space and cyber capabilities. It is clear, if we do not invest more, our collective defense is not credible. Spending more is not about pleasing an audience of one. It is about protecting 1 billion people. Allies will also make broader defense and security-related investments, including infrastructure. Roads, rail and ports are just as important as tanks, fighters and warships. We need civilian transport networks that can support military mobility, to get the right forces to the right place at the right time. The home front and the front line are now one and the same. War is no longer fought at a distance. Our societies and militaries are in this together. We will invest more in civil preparedness, so our societies are ready for the day we pray will never come. And NATO works 24/7 to ensure that day never arrives. We will also spend more to protect our societies against cyber attacks, sabotage, and other threats. And broader defense and security-related investments should include financing and capital improvements to our defense industrial base. It is clear that right across the alliance, we are not producing enough. So as we increase defense investment, we need to increase defense production. More demand means increasing supply, not higher prices. And it also means ensuring that the alliance can produce at scale and at speed. We need raw industrial capacity, like Sheffield Forgemasters, which I visited this morning with Defense Secretary John Healey. We need cheaper electricity, access to critical minerals, and more engineering know-how. Otherwise, the commitment to spend 5% of GDP on defense will be lost to production costs rather than invested in defense. So we will enhance and expand the industrial base right across the alliance. We will support increased defense production, remove barriers to cooperation, and harness cutting-edge technologies. To borrow from the former Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, I want NATO to forge its future in the white heat of innovation. To stay ahead of our adversaries, we must develop and adopt new technologies. They can be cost-effective and deliver the same effect as traditional military heavy metal. On the battlefields of Ukraine, $400 drones used the right way are taking out $2 million Russian tanks. More defense spending and production provides effective deterrence, promotes economic growth, and creates jobs. The summit in The Hague will send a clear demand signal to industry. And industry must meet our ambition. So, we will make NATO stronger by spending and producing more. And we will make NATO fairer by rebalancing the burden of our security, with every ally contributing their fair share. We all benefit from the protection our transatlantic alliance provides. And it is vital that every member of NATO pulls their weight, because America has carried too much of the burden for too long. America's allies have broad shoulders, and Europe and Canada will do more for our shared security. And that will be backed by America's rock-solid commitment to NATO. As well as becoming stronger and fairer, NATO will become more lethal. Rest assured, we will always be a defensive alliance. Becoming more lethal means strengthening our deterrence and defense posture, providing our militaries with what they need to keep us safe, and showing any aggressor we can and will hit back harder. With our military power and our resolve to use it if necessary, no one should even think about attacking us. President Putin does not act like someone who is interested in peace. Russia continues to strike civilian targets in Ukraine, day after day, night after night. This is violence for the sake of violence. We fully support President Trump's efforts to stop the bloodshed. The people of Ukraine deserve a just and lasting peace. NATO's practical and political support to Ukraine continues. Our long-term support is not about prolonging the war. It is about helping Ukraine defend itself today and preventing any future aggression. NATO stands with Ukraine now and through the challenges ahead. In an age of uncertainty, a strong transatlantic bond is essential. And the enduring commitment by all NATO allies to Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on all, sends a powerful message. We will defend against any threat from any direction. History has shown that North America and Europe working together is a winning combination. The venue for our summit in The Hague is on Churchillplein, Churchill Square. His bulldog spirit is alive today in NATO. We have the confidence, commitment and courage to do whatever it takes to protect our way of life. There are no second chances when it comes to our security. So we will deliver in The Hague. Friends can be frank with each other, and there will be tough decisions to take. But let us not lose sight of what is at stake: the security of 1 billion people on both sides of the Atlantic. Together, we will secure peace through strength. Together, we will make our alliance stronger, fairer and more lethal. And together, we will build a better NATO. Thank you.
Well, that's NATO Secretary General. He's going to take questions in a moment or two, but this was described as a keynote speech. You can see why, talking about a quantum leap in collective defence spending. And he wants at that summit at The Hague an agreement for 5% spending on defence, 3.5% on core military requirements, the other 1.5% on defence infrastructure and industrial capacity. Let's put the microphones back up.
Straight away, you've used the word lethal quite a bit. What point are you trying to make through that?
The point I want to make is, yes, we are still a defensive alliance, but we are deadly serious that if anyone tries to attack us, that the consequences for that attacker will be devastating. Be it Russia or anyone else who tries to do anything against us. And we have to be absolutely clear. And this is not only about the money and the weaponry, it is also about the mentality, that we do realize that there is a lot at stake here. And the people trying to act against us must understand this.
So what is the main threat to NATO members? Is it Russia, which everyone in Europe is very conscious of, or is it China, which seems to be the focus of the US's alarms in the world?
The main long-term threat against NATO is Russia, there's no doubt. But you rightly said there is more than Russia. And NATO was never established to fight only the Soviet Union. It was there to protect NATO territory from anyone who tried to attack us. And what we see at the moment is an enormous build-up in China of their military capabilities. I mentioned in the speech, including what they do Navy-wise. They will have in 2030 100 more ships than the US has currently. And they have a defense industrial base in China to build even more ships, which the Americans at this moment can absolutely not compete with. This is one of the big issues we have, that when it comes to defense spending, there is an issue with Europe and Canada. When it comes to defense production, there is an issue with Europe, Canada and the United States. Because all over the alliance, we are not producing enough. And China is working together with North Korea, Iran, They are supporting, as we all know, Russia's war effort against Ukraine. So these four working together is, of course, a relevant development. So yes, Russia, but clearly also focusing on what China is doing, and of course, the fact that these four working together and North Korea getting the latest technologies from Russia and others in return for their support to Russia in the war effort against Ukraine.
So in terms of strategy, it is Russia, it is China, and is the others working with them, all of these?
Yeah, so NATO wants to protect its territory for 1 billion people. And of course, when you ask me what is your first and main threat long-term, it is Russia, absolutely. But we have to be conscious of what is happening. And I was visiting 2 months ago Japan, speaking with the whole senior leadership there. And of course, they are very worried about what's happening in the Pacific. They really very much value the relationship they have with NATO. That is also true for Korea, the Republic of Korea, for Australia, for New Zealand, the so-called Indo-Pacific Four. And it shows you that we cannot think that there is one theater which is the Euro-Atlantic theater. Yes, of course, that's the main theater we are focusing on. But we have to be conscious of the fact that this is all interconnected with what is happening in the Pacific. And the war in Ukraine, Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, clearly shows that all these countries work together here.
Can NATO survive a drawdown of US presence in Europe and some of the questions that the US has directed at NATO about its value?
Since President Trump came in office, in the first couple of weeks I got many questions from European leaders. Will the US stay committed to NATO? And I told them, I said, well, you might want to put on your television and listen to President Trump when he has President Macron in office, or Prime Minister Starmer, or Prime Minister Maloney. When I was visiting, others were, and recently, of course, Chancellor Merz. And there is a total commitment from the American president and down the whole system to NATO, but also an expectation. And the expectation is that we in Europe and Canada will indeed equalize in spending with the US. And we have to do that, not only to equalize, but we need that 3.5 core defense spending to be able to deliver the capability targets. Then there is the question, okay, if they then stay, Mark, with NATO, might they all of a sudden decide that SACEUR should be a European general, the Supreme Allied Commander, which has traditionally always been an American general, because there were these rumors. Well, there's your evidence. Last week the appointment was announced of the new Supreme Allied Commander and holding an American passport. And the third question is, will they all of a sudden withdraw troops from Europe? There's absolutely no question of that. What they have said is that, yes, obviously for the United States, not only concentrating on the Euro-Atlantic, but also as the biggest worldwide economy and the biggest defense power in the world, they also have to, of course, focus on the Indo-Pacific, they have to focus on the Middle East, and that over time there will be somewhat more pivoting towards Asia is only logical. I'm not worried about that, but I'm absolutely convinced we will do that in a step-by-step approach. There will be no capability gaps in Europe because of this, and there's absolutely no... And you've seen it when, again, Chancellor Merz visited the White House when it came to the American troops presence in Germany, and a clear commitment of the American president on that point.
So no capability gaps in Europe. Over what period? Can you say that immediately, that the US drawdown won't happen too fast? I think we can say that the US under President Trump has won this argument that that has been there for a very long time about Europe needing to spend more, and you've embraced that in what you've said. But he has also said a lot of other things, indeed, about pivoting to Asia. We'll come on to Ukraine in a moment. But on the US perhaps having fewer troops in Europe, is that not going to leave Europe exposed at any point?
Not at all. I have no worry about that. And why not? Because in the United States, with everybody I speak with in the Pentagon, in State Department, in the White House, the President, the National Security Council, people are aware. NATO is not only there to, again, quote Churchill, not quote, but referring to Churchill in his famous speech in the US Congress in December '41, to prevent the mistake after the First World War, again after that then ongoing Second World War after Pearl Harbor, when he gave that speech, that the long arm of history will reach out again across the Atlantic Ocean to get the new world involved in a war in the old world. It's not only because of that historical reason. In the US, all the generals, all the senior policymakers totally understand that for the US homeland security, for the defense of the homeland of the mainland US, its territory, a secure Atlantic, a secure Arctic, and a secure Europe is crucial. When the Norwegian Prime Minister was visiting, he showed President Trump the pictures of the nuclear submarines just across the border between Norway and Russia. We sometimes forget that Norway has all over Sweden and Finland this border with Russia. And there is that big, one of the biggest, maybe the biggest Russian submarine port. And he said, Mr. President, these nuclear submarines are not there to target Norway. They are there to target the United States. And what we do collectively is make sure that they can never do that. So that deep realization that our security, Europe, Canada, US, is interconnected practically, so not only for historical reasons, but practically, is deeply ingrained in the US. And at the same time, they have more things to think about, like the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East, and sometimes also when it comes to Africa, which is only logical. So we spending more for them to pivot more towards, for example, the Indo-Pacific, over time, step by step, is possible.
What about Ukraine itself? Does it not weaken NATO in some sense if the US president says, look, NATO was part of the provocation for Russia of this war, Ukraine started it, and begins to talk about ways of settling that seem to make many concessions to Russia?
But look what President Trump did since he came in office. He
Many things.
Well, I know, I agree, but he broke the deadlock when it comes to Ukraine. He broke the deadlock with Russia. And I'm of the opinion that it is only the American president who was able to do this, to start the dialogue again with President Putin on how to end this terrible war, and he did. And no criticism of his predecessor. I respect all the politicians in the US, and we work with everybody. But him doing that, breaking that deadlock, and starting that dialogue with the Russian president, and then for us in Europe to think, okay, we can in a couple of months then end all of this. Of course, no, this takes time. It is a step-by-step approach, but it is clear that he closely coordinates with European allies, including the UK Prime Minister and others here in Europe and with Canada, on all the steps he's taking. And every phone call he has with President Putin, he prepares with the Europeans, and he then briefs out to the Europeans and the Ukrainians afterwards. But him doing this, I think, is extremely important, because it is the only way to step by step bring the Russians to a position where they want to end it.
To end it and not continue. So in your view, what would be the terms of that kind of agreement that would persuade Russia to stop where it is now, or to move back?
I don't want to make it even more difficult by having, as NATO Secretary General, start to philosophize here in an open session about what it might look like. But what we do know, what we all agree on, is that whatever the long-term ceasefire, or even better, a real peace agreement will look like, the most important thing is that post that long-term ceasefire and or peace agreement, we have to make sure that it is lasting, that it is durable, and that Putin will never ever try to do this again. And this is why Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, together with the French President, and now with a large group of European countries and Canada, is working on what security guarantees might look like, so that going forward, we can be assured that when there is a peace deal or a ceasefire, that we have the plans in place, we can implement them, on the day after that happens. And that preparation, I think, is also in close coordination with the Americans, is again evidence that this transatlantic relationship is very strong.
You've mentioned Canada a couple of times, and many people have asked whether NATO can accommodate a member that is threatening the sovereignty of another member, as the US has been with Canada.
Well, obviously, as Secretary General of NATO, I never comment about discussions between NATO allies. But I've seen a very successful visit of the Canadian Prime Minister to the White House. So it's my impression that whatever issues there are, they are dealing with that in an amicable way.
And NATO, turning back to Europe then, NATO is working, many people have said, very closely with the European Union at the moment. But there are still big differences of opinion within the European Union, within European members, particularly on Russia. How do you accommodate that? You're obviously not responsible for what all these prime ministers and presidents say, but still you are trying to arrange some kind of agreement of strategy between them. And I'm thinking of Hungary and Slovakia's attitudes to Russia, for example.
And by the way, they're all also allies within NATO, both Hungary and Slovakia, and we are always able, in the end, to come to an agreement with the 32. NATO was never established to have a kumbaya where we would immediately, from minute one, agree on everything. So to have that debate as democratic societies within a democratic alliance, which is based on unanimity, I think only strengthens the alliance. And when it comes to the cooperation with the EU, you're right. We are working closely together with the European Commission, with Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, Antonio Costa, the Chair of the President of the European Council, but also with the High Representative, Kaja Kallas, with the President of the European Parliament, with Andris Kubilius, the Defence Commissioner. It's a real close cooperation, where we all agree that when it comes to the division of labour, NATO is about the hard setting of the hard standard setting, making sure that we know what we need in terms of capabilities, the standards when it comes to our systems and weaponry, etc. And the EU is in the position of the power of the internal market. For example, getting the industrial base going, making sure that these investments will take place, that ultimately in a couple of years we will not conclude that we still buy the same amount of weaponry, which is far from enough, but at a higher price. And that cooperation is really working very well.
Mm. Now, how would you explain to people who are running a government now, a democratic government, how to explain to their voters why so much money is suddenly needed on defence? The numbers are going up. This government has taken time to commit to 2.5%. Suddenly people are talking about 3, even 5, as you're saying. So they have to go, as this government will. It's on Wednesday, has its spending review in Parliament, an illustration of how much money there isn't for lots of things. How would you suggest to them that they explain to voters why this is so necessary now?
I would explain it in a way by saying that the world we thought we were entering in after the Berlin Wall came down is definitely gone. This whole idea that we would have a sort of pleasant, peaceful living together with the Russians is gone. That Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is clearly expansionistic. What he has done with Ukraine is really staggering. The amount of death on both sides, also on the Russian side, by the way, is amazing. The investments he is making, his economy is on a total war footing. As I said in my speech, and let me repeat it again, NATO economy is 25 times bigger than Russia. It's 50 trillion, and the Russian economy is 2 trillion. That 2 trillion economy is producing 4 times as much ammunition as the whole of NATO is producing at the moment. And you can ask any general, and he will tell you, yes, drones and AI, etc., but Mark, the core of every war will always start with stockpiles of ammunition. You can never, ever allow for a situation where your ammunition piles are not sufficiently stocked. And here, the Russians are outpacing us 4-1, 4 times as much as we are producing. And again, we are 25 times bigger. And then look at our air defense systems. We simply do not have enough. In the UK, all over Europe, in Canada, the US, in the whole of NATO. And these are huge investments. We need 5 times as many systems to defend ourselves against missiles and air defense in general. That's a 400% increase. It's huge investments. Our maneuverable land formations, we simply do not have enough. The UK, Germany, all over Europe, we do not have enough. Our command and control systems, our long-range weapons. So there is the clear gaps are there, and we have a heavily reconstituting Russia at a pace which is really threatening. They cannot mount a successful attack against NATO territory now, but in 3 to 5 years they might be able.
I wanted to ask you about exactly this point. And you put a lot of weight on that, exactly that sentence in your speech. Is that based on military capability, or is it based on a reckoning of their planning? What did you mean by picking out
Well,
that
the generals are telling us
3 to 5 years
Well,
that they could attack NATO territory?
Yes, so for example, last week it was the German Chief of Defense saying by 2029, that's in 4 years, they might be ready to do that. And this is just based on the military people telling us, look what Russia is doing, look where we are. Yes, we can still defend ourselves. But if we do not start today with getting our defense industrial base in order, getting the ammunition production going, getting our air defense systems production going. Take the Patriot, the most important air defense system we have, or the most advanced at the moment. You will get it in 10 years if you order it today. And the question is a bit like in the old times of the Soviet Union, that you can ask the return question in the morning or the afternoon. Why is that important? Yes, in the afternoon the F-35 will arrive. So these are the timelines we are facing at the moment, and I'm only slightly exaggerating here. And therefore, what keeps me awake at night is not only the spending part. I think we will get there at the summit. What I'm really getting awake at night, where I'm staying awake at night, is because of the defense production. Because for your credible deterrence, it is not only about spending and people, it is also about being able to produce of course, the latest technologies, drones, etc. I commend what the UK put in the defense review on all of this. So it's really great stuff, and we need that. But you still also need to make sure that you can produce the classic big ticket items.
Hence your visit to Sheffield. Let's go to questions. There are tons online. Let me start over here. Let me start at that side and take those two at the edge. Let's take them in.
Thanks very much. Carl Dinnan from ITV News. You've just come from Downing Street, where you were talking to the Prime Minister. Did he agree that Britain would spend the 3.5% that you want as core defence spending? And what is the timeline that you have agreed with him for that?
Well, obviously, I don't have a vote in the NATO summit. I'm holding the gavel. And it's also not up to me to disclose what we discussed, because I don't think that's fair. But let me just try to answer your question in a different way. First of all, I've seen sometimes in the British press that there is the defense review, and now there is this proposal I made about the 5%, the 3.5 core and 1.5 defense and security related spending. So then people are saying, hey, there is a discrepancy. I don't think there is. Why not? Because every country is working in cycles to constantly update its own defense strategy. That's exactly what the UK is doing, and I'm really impressed with what John Healey, the Defense Secretary, and the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, have brought out last week. Because it's exactly what we need. The drones, the latest technology, but also, for example, investing in 6 factories producing ammunition. I mean, you heard me about my worries about ammunition. I mean, this is at the core of the UK defense review, including the spending targets to get there. And then there is, and this is happening in many countries in different cycles, etc. And there is this summit coming up discussing how we get, over time, with a credible path to get there, a longer term goal of this 5% defense spending. So I don't see a discrepancy here. We will, as I was here today, I will visit Italy later this week and also Sweden. And I will be in Canada next week. So we will have many more consultations and we will discuss the details, of course, in Brussels. I really think we will get to a common position.
Okay, I'm going to take a few more down here. Let's take the next one along and then in the row behind. Go ahead.
Harry Fawcett from Channel 4 News. You said that the 1.5% defence-related spending was grounded in reality and it's not for an audience of one. It is, though, it seems like a happy coincidence that 1.5 plus 3.5 equals 5, and there is some criticism that there is an elasticity in how to define what comprises that kind of spending. So how do you respond to those concerns, and is there a metric to define exactly what should fall within that 1.5%?
So what we did, we had the old 2%, which was agreed in Wales, and there are clear definitions what you can count to the 2% core defense spending. We are not going to change those criteria. So they will remain, and the 2%, if I get my way, will be 3.5%. But then when we were discussing all of this, and also look at the UK Defence Review, which is also spending a lot of time on this and a lot of is discussing this. Yes, there is the core defence spending, but you need bridges which are able to hold a tank. Sometimes you are even not daring with your car to cross the bridge, let alone with a tank. You need the defence industrial base to be developed. For example, this factory in Sheffield was bought by the UK government because it is delivering core capabilities which are essential to the UK defence requirements. Buying such a factory is not a defence spend in the 2%. But still you need to do it, and you need to develop the defence industrial base because we simply do not have enough. And then we have the issue of societal preparedness. When you watch Norway or Finland or Sweden, what they are doing in terms of having the whole of society to understand what their role will be it active or at least not getting in the way of the military people if war breaks out or a natural disaster hits. I mean, in many other countries, my country, many other countries, we are not nearly there. So all this spending also needs to be done. And we have calculated this at roughly 1.5%. We are now discussing in Brussels the more specific items, but these are the big ones. So defence industrial base, developing your infrastructure in a way that it can help you to move from A to B with military and equipment. But also this big issue of preparing your civilian populations for whatever might happen. And there's a lot of money, so we need to do that.
Okay, I'm going to take one in the, yes, and then I'm coming to some more over here.
Hello, Edward Lucas in The Times. You mentioned in your speech improvements to the defence defence finance and investment. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit. Is this an allusion to the idea of a defence bank, which John Healey was talking about at the weekend? It's not just a matter of spending more money, it's spending it more effectively, which you've alluded to.
There are a couple of initiatives out there, so I was not particularly alluding to that, but I know of these initiatives and we follow them with great interest because everything making it possible to get the money and spend it where we need to spend it is positive. But it's always a bit tricky for me to get into the details of each of these initiatives. But take another initiative, which is the European Union. What the EU is doing with Re-aim Europe, which is an 800 billion package in which you have the 150 billion SAFE program. You could also argue that that is also part of freeing up the money at a national level to make it possible for countries to invest enough. So it is really optimizing here, but it's also about your defense industrial base. That there might be opportunities when maybe in the future you would have unavoidable closures of some big industrial plants for whatever reason, because this is part of your normal economic cycle. And of course, always regrettable, but not always avoidable. That you look in a pragmatic way whether this is an opportunity now to use that particular asset to converge into defense production. So all of these issues are falling under that sentence.
Thank you. I'm going to take a few which are about Ukraine or fighting.
Don't do the BBC.
Fighting now. I'll come. All right, go on.
I was already watching
I'm open to suggestions, then I'm coming to Ukraine.
Thank you, Secretary General.
We don't want to be in a fight with you.
Jonathan Beale from BBC. You didn't actually answer the question that Carl asked.
The next question.
Which was, what is the deadline for this? Is it 2032 or 2035? Are you saying also that spending 3% is the same as 3.5%? Because it doesn't, to me, that seems a little bit odd. And then finally, are you going to include? Are you going to allow the UK government to include? They include at the moment in their 2.3% costs on security services, MI5, MI6. Do you consider that to be core defence spending? Thank you. Well,
first of all, the definitions we use when it comes to the present 2%, and for the UK that is now 2.3, moving into 2.5, and I also heard the number of 3. We are not changing these definitions. And there's always a little bit room of flexibility, but not a lot. And so that's something there. I know from my previous role that we had many debates with NATO, what the Netherlands could figure in the defense spending and not. And there's always a little bit of a negotiation going on there. And then in the end, you somehow reach a consensus. So I'm not aware of what exactly the debates are between the UK and NATO on what they figure in the 2.3 and 2.5, let's say in the 2%. But I would not be amazed that that debate takes place, because most allies are having those discussions. When it comes to your first question, I have a clear view on when we should achieve that. I keep that to myself because we are having these consultations now with allies, and these discussions are ongoing, and we will in the end agree on a date when we have to be there. For me, it is important that it will not be, as I said last week when we met in Brussels, it will be a flat line, and then at the year where we have to achieve the 5%, the 3.5 and the 1.5 a hockey stick, and then all of a sudden, because you cannot spend all that money in 1 year, there is an absorption capacity issue. You can only spend so much extra each year, so there has to be a credible path. That for me is very important, that countries commit to that and develop that path and share that with NATO, so that we would not have the same as in 2014. We commit all to 2%. The UK was on 2%, Greece was on 2%, the US was on 2%, but basically till Trump became president, nothing happened. And then all of a sudden everybody woke up in Brussels in 2018, and the spending went up. So we have to have a credible path there. And then I didn't understand the 3. So for what I propose is 3.5 core defense spending by date X, and that's being discussed now, and 1.5 on defense related. So we are not putting out a number of 3 anywhere.
Okay. So anyone got a question on Ukraine and Russia? There's quite a lot online. I want to take a whole group. Let me take several on that. Aricia, who's here, and then I'm going to come right to the back.
Thanks very much, Bronwyn. Thanks, Secretary General, for coming and speaking to us. I have a question. 2 summits in a row, Ukraine was said that it has an irreversible path to NATO. Fast forward this spring, we hear that the United States is perhaps ready to offer Russia a concession, which means Ukraine will not join the NATO. So my question is whether such concession would make NATO better or worse, and will Ukraine join you in The Hague?
Well, first of all, my aim now is for this summer to have a very concise list of conclusions. So a communique which is concise. You know, from the last Washington summit, I think it was 60 pages, 19 paragraphs. It will be considerably more condensed than that. And that means that you do not always have to repeat every sentence and every previous made commitment because it stands. The strategic concept stands, the Washington communique stands. So the irreversible path of Ukraine into NATO is there, and it is my assumption that it is still there after the summit. Whether it is again in the communique or not, I think that's not relevant, because all the language we previously agreed on is there, till we decide it is not any longer there. So I pretty much presume that at my presser after the summit, I will repeat that sentence as being part of what NATO agreed. And we are building that bridge as we are speaking, through the command in Wiesbaden, through the organization in Poland we have jointly with Ukraine to capture all the lessons, through the comprehensive assistance package, all the other activities. Of course, our team in Kiev, the NATO team in Kiev, working closely with the Ukrainian government. So all of this is there, and building basically the bridge. And what I would assume that the NATO summit will be really about spending, it will be about production. Of course there will be Ukraine in the communique, no doubt, but don't expect endless paragraphs of restating what we already said in the past. That's all there, and it will stay there. And then on America, but not only the US has come out for a long time against Ukraine joining NATO. There have been other allies, take Hungary, take Slovakia and others, who have said we are against that. So the language is there is this irreversible path into NATO. And again, I think that the Hague communique will be really very much focused on a few issues.
Okay, thanks. Let me go right to the back, and then here in the front. Yep.
Crispin Ellison, member. Secretary General, thanks very much for your talk and the questions. You emphasise production in Russia is about 4 times that of NATO, but they're not building stockpiles. They have no stockpiles. They are using that. Is it fair to say then that the clock starts ticking and the risks to NATO start increasing once we get a sustainable ceasefire and that production is put into stockpiles?
A statement of fact, I think. And by the way, our assumption at the moment is that even whilst the war against Ukraine is continuing, that they're still able to slightly increase stockpiles, but that's debatable. But I think to your question, I mean, that's a statement of fact. Yeah.
Okay, let me come over here to the front.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary General. I'm Francis Stoney, The Telegraph. There's an American outlet this morning that's describing Trump's reaction to the deep strikes on Russian territory by the Ukrainian drones as being badass. I wonder what your reaction was to that, because and whether you agree with Kyiv that to end this war is going to require additional long-range strikes into Russia to take out its industrial capacity.
Well, to end this war, we need Putin to come to the negotiating table and not with this historian who is now popping up in Istanbul twice and again telling us about the history of Russia and Ukraine from whatever the 12th century, I don't know what it was, and constantly restating what they stated already in 2022. You need a Russia which is serious, wants to negotiate and end the war. And to get there, it all, I think, starts, of course, with keeping Ukraine strong in the fight. But also we need what President Trump has been doing, breaking the deadlock with Putin, starting that dialogue. I really think it starts from there. And when it comes to what happened Sunday a week ago, let's not forget what the Ukrainians were doing was taking out capabilities of Russia to hit innocent civilians in Ukrainian cities and communities, going about their daily lives, not being in the military, just normal, average citizens, as we are sitting here in this room, being under the threat of these Russian capabilities. And in a very innovative way, they diminished to a certain extent, and we don't know exactly what the extent is, but of course it had a considerable impact, it seems, the capabilities of Russia on this.
Quite a few questions online about whether you're expecting a big summer offensive from Russia, either against Ukraine or looking at Lucy Rogers' question, military images of Russian bases along NATO's eastern flank. But I think the thrust of the questions is about a summer offensive against Ukraine.
We don't expect any offensive against NATO territory. There's no reason to believe that. Yeah. Because again, the next 3 to 5 years, he knows that the reaction will be devastating for Russia, so they will not do that. But we have to make sure 3 to 5 years he still knows that it is devastating, so that we are prepared. And when it comes to Ukraine, I'm not predicting what might happen on the Russian side. What we have to do is to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs, and the ongoing military support. The United Kingdom, by the way, we are here in London. This country is on at the forefront since the start of the war. Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, and now Keir Starmer, providing consistent leadership when it comes to keeping Ukraine in the fight. And of course, together with other European nations, but the UK has really been one of the leaders in this effort.
Let's go right at the back. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Farah Muslimi. I'm from the Middle East steamer Chatham House. My question is not about Ukraine, but about Russia. Do you see Russians or the Chinese playing any role in the Red Sea, in arming the Houthis or training them? And overall, where does the NATO see the Red Sea crisis, let's say, in your top 10 of risks? Does that flag on your radar overall? Thank you.
Well, here our biggest worry, of course, is with Iran. And the fact that Iran is part of this foursome, this really awful foursome of North Korea, China, Iran and Russia. I have no reason to believe, and no one has any reason to believe, that Iran is doing this because they just want to be friendly to the Russians. We assume that they get a lot for this in return, particularly money. And as we know, Iran uses this money directly and through its proxies to stir conflict in the Middle East. So there is at least an indirect link, as there is a link between what North Korea is doing, supporting Russia's war effort, getting missile technology in return, which is posing a threat to the US mainland.
Okay, thank you. Let me come in the orange.
Danielle Sheridan from The Telegraph. Do you think this Wednesday...
How many are here from The Telegraph?
There was also a Telegraph.
Yeah.
A big newspaper.
I was almost not going to say where I was from, actually. But do you think this Wednesday we should see the Chancellor raise taxes in order to cover the defence spending that you think is required?
Well, it's not up to me to decide, of course, how countries pay the bill. I mean, what I know is that if we want to keep our societies safe, and look, if you do not do this, if we would not go to the 5%, including the 3.5% core defense spending, you could still have the National Health Service, or in other countries their health systems, the pension systems, etc. But you'd better learn to speak Russian. I mean, that's the consequence. I mean, when I came to NATO, people sometimes told me, yeah, but Mark, bringing these brutal facts out in the open might also rattle our populations. Yes, they'd better be rattled, because this is a reality. I mean, let's be honest. It's our task as politicians to be brutally honest how we see the facts and what is and the facts are clearly there that Russia is able, within 5 years, to mount a credible attack against NATO territory if we do not now start to take these decisions. And then, of course, there is the issue how to finance that. Well, that's up to national politicians. And there are always, I mean, when I was in politics, you had 3 sources to do this from. One is taxation, another is savings elsewhere, and the third one is a higher deficit. I mean, in the end, politics is making choices in scarcity. This is why you choose your politicians. And then a center-left politician will make different choices from a center-right politician. But okay, that's up to the national government. But my point is, we've got to do it.
The Dutch government, which was pursuing very much your line about increasing defence spending and support for Ukraine, has collapsed. Do you feel that...
but not because of this problem.
No. Because of the difficulty in spending. All right, let me just try and tuck in a couple more, at least one more question. Right here on the edge, there were lots and lots and lots of hands up, and I'm going to go here in the middle. Let me take 2 together. But on the edge, please.
Hi there, Johnny Singh, Chatham House member. You mentioned critical minerals here. Hello.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned critical minerals in your speech. I wonder what role do you envisage NATO has in either securing or procuring or the supply routes around critical minerals?
Okay, let me take. There's one on the edge of the aisle there, and I'm going to get in the front here as well. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeroen Ouwehand, and as a citizen of The Hague, I wish you all the best and good luck with the summit in a few weeks.
You already have left the city because of that.
Well, I'll be back. I'll be back before the summit. But I say so as a citizen of The Hague, but also as a worried NATO.
This is absolutely
citizen.
wonderful. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I do. Apart from wishing you good luck, and my question has nothing to do with which has been on the table so far, but it's about climate change. And I just wondered, EU Commissioner Hoekstra warned about the security threats as a result of climate change, and I wondered what your thoughts were on that, with this increased spending, how that is factored into your thinking.
Very good question.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to slide in this one here at the front. You have a microphone. Sorry. Really quick.
My name is Nishant Shilkuri. I'm a Chatham House member and I work for Mail Online. I'm sure you've paid attention to Elon Musk's feud with Donald Trump. What view does NATO take of this, and how has it sort of impacted your wargaming strategies because of dependence on Starlink and SpaceX?
I was waiting for you to make the connection. Thank you very much. Tempting as it was. Right, critical minerals, climate change.
Quickly on critical minerals, the role here for NATO will be a typical coordinating role. So we provide a platform to discuss this wherever necessary, because logistics, supply chain, all these issues, making sure, for example, that when it comes to ammunition production, we have all the basic materials to do that. Obviously, nations are working on this, allies, but NATO can always provide a platform to have that discussion more and more coordinated. On climate change, obviously, this is a case in point. What we are seeing is that, for example, the Arctic is opening up. So it has an impact. And the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are now sailing in the Arctic, and that the 7 high north countries, US, Canada, Sweden, Finland, Denmark and Iceland, have asked NATO to become more involved here. And we will do that. Is clear evidence of this. And so we have the issue of icebreakers, China, Russia active there. And this has to do with the fact that these routes are opening up. And this has to do with the fact that global warming is taking place. And NATO has, after long consideration, decided not to have a view on what is happening at the moment.
Okay, thank you. We are going to have to stop there. I'm so sorry. Thank you for the terrific questions online.
Yeah.
I didn't take so many because they overlap with what we had discussed already, but they were great and great to have them. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for your excellent questions. Please join me in thanking the Secretary General.
So that was the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte taking some questions there at the end of his speech. And you may have heard earlier that was quite a punchy speech with some strong words there. Let me just take you through some of the key points. So he said, to prepare for peace, we must prepare for war. He said there needs to be a quantum leap in defence spending. And he said the threat, unsurprisingly, you might think the threat, he said, was mainly from Russia, but was also from China, North Korea and Iran. The awful foursome, he called it in the questions there. And he said that really Russia is producing more weapons and faster than we thought. So what has Russia had to say in response? Well, I've had a look and we haven't got any responses yet from the Kremlin, but what we do have is what was said before the speech, before he made his speech, because actually a bit of the speech was published so that people were aware of what he was expected to say. And what we have is a response from the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who told reporters in Moscow that NATO is demonstrating itself as an instrument of aggression and confrontation. So that's what we have so far as a response from Moscow. And what I'll do now is, before we go on a little bit further, because there are a lot of questions we've got in terms of what he didn't say and what he didn't clarify, but let me give you a little bit of an overview of what he said by hearing a little bit of an extract of what he said earlier.
History has taught us that to preserve peace, we must prepare for war. Wishful thinking will not keep us safe. We cannot dream away the danger. Hope is not a strategy. So NATO has to become a stronger, fairer and more lethal alliance. A stronger NATO means spending much more on our defence. All allies will reach the initial target of spending 2% of GDP on defence this year. That was a pledge made way back in 2014. Now we have a concrete plan for the future. We know what we need. And we know what to do. At the summit in The Hague, I expect allied leaders will agree to spend 5% of GDP on defence. It will be a NATO-wide commitment and a defining moment for the alliance. There are two parts to this new defence spending plan. 3.5% will be invested in our core military requirements, while the rest will go towards defence and security-related investments, including infrastructure and building industrial capacity. 5% is not some figure plucked from the air. It's grounded in hard facts. The fact is, we need a quantum leap in our collective defence. The fact is, we must have more forces and capabilities to implement our defence plans in full. The fact is, danger will not disappear. even when the war in Ukraine ends. Our decisions on defense spending are driven by NATO's battle plans and capability targets. They define what forces and capabilities allies need to provide. And last week, NATO defense ministers agreed ambitious new targets. The exact details are classified, but we need a 400% increase in air and missile defense. We see in Ukraine how Russia delivers terror from above. So we will strengthen the shield that protects our skies. Our militaries also need thousands more armored vehicles and tanks, millions more artillery shells. And we must double our enabling capabilities, such as logistics, supply, transportation, and medical support. Allies will invest in more warships and aircraft. To give just one example, America's allies will procure at least 700 F-35 fighter jets in total. We will also invest in more drones and long-range missile systems, and invest more in space and cyber capabilities. It is clear, if we do not invest more, our collective defense is not credible. Spending more is not about pleasing an audience of one. It is about protecting 1 billion people. Allies will also make broader defense and security-related investments, including infrastructure. Roads, rail and ports are just as important as tanks, fighters and warships. We need civilian transport networks that can support military mobility, to get the right forces to the right place at the right time. The home front and the front line are now one and the same. War is no longer fought at a distance. Our societies and militaries are in this together. We will invest more in civil preparedness, so our societies are ready for the day we pray will never come. And NATO works 24/7 to ensure that day never arrives. We will also spend more to protect our societies against cyber attacks, sabotage and other threats. And broader defense and security-related investments should include financing and capital improvements to our defense industrial base. It is clear that right across the alliance, we are not producing enough. So as we increase defense investment, we need to increase defense production. More demand means increasing supply, not higher prices. And it also means ensuring that the alliance can produce at scale and at speed. We need raw industrial capacity, like Sheffield Forgemasters, which I visited this morning with Defense Secretary John Healey. We need cheaper electricity, access to critical minerals, and more engineering know-how. Otherwise, the commitment to spend 5% of GDP on defense will be lost to production costs rather than invested in defense. So we will enhance and expand the industrial base right across the alliance. We will support increased defense production, remove barriers to cooperation, and harness cutting-edge technologies.
That's NATO Chief Mark Rutte there talking about what's needed from allies. In a moment, we're going to get reaction to his speech from an analyst, and we're also going to be hearing from our correspondent who was in there while all this was going on. But first, let's have a little unpick of what he said there in terms of the need for allies to spend more of their GDP on defence. One of the things he said in his speech is that every ally should contribute their fair share, and that the US has carried too much of the burden for too long. And of course, you may remember that the US President Donald Trump has already been talking about this in the past few days and weeks. He's been pressing NATO members to announce an increase in their military budgets and pushing them to increase it from what the current target is of 2% up to 5% of GDP. So you might wonder, well, what are the different allies spending? So let's take a look. So there are 32 members. The current target is 2% on GDP on defence per year, and that was by the year 2024. That's the previous year we've got figures for. 23 of the members are expected to have achieved that, and according to NATO estimates for that year, The one that was the top military spender in terms of GDP was Poland, with 4.1% of its GDP. Estonia was second with 3.4%. The US was third with around the same level, 3.4%. Where did the UK come? Well, we were ninth on the list with 2.3%. You may remember that in the past week we've been hearing from the government about what it's committing to spend in the future, and it is committing to an increase in that. It's saying that it's going to increase it to 2.5% of the UK's GDP, though it hasn't said when that will happen. But we also do know that the government has said its ambition is to increase that to 3% by the year 2034. One of the things we need to get a bit of clarity on, which wasn't provided in the questions to Mark Rutte, as you may have heard there in his answers, which was he seemed to be very satisfied with what the UK was doing or committing to in terms of its defence spending. But that is 3% core with 1.5% on other things that are related to security. But Mr Rutte seemed to think that that sort of came to around 5%, or at least it equated to something that he was happy with, in line with the 5% target. So we'll have to see if we can get a little bit more clarity on that, because that wasn't provided in the questions and answers. So now let's look a little bit about why he said this was so important. So he, as I mentioned, he talked about the threat from Russia and the fact that he said Russia was producing more weapons and faster than he thought. But there were some key points that came from his speech there. One of the quotes that stood out was he said, and this was in actually the questions and answers afterwards, he said, "The world that we thought we were entering after the Berlin Wall came down is gone." He said that the Russian President Putin, is expansionistic, that their economy is on a total war footing, and he emphasised the importance of stockpiles of ammunition, aside from the importance of more advanced technology, such as drone technology and AI. He said that ultimately stockpiles of ammunition is actually key at the heart of it, old traditional form of defence spending. And he said Russia is outpacing NATO 4-1 in producing that, which is quite a key, which is quite a large ratio. One of the questions afterwards, somebody raised the point that actually, and this is actually it's a very interesting paradox, and I don't really know what to make of it. So again, we'll put this to our correspondent if we can, which is that once the ceasefire happens in Ukraine, Russia will be able to increase its stockpile, because at the moment it is all currently being in use. So once a ceasefire is reached, if that does happen between Russia and Ukraine, suddenly Russia is able to increase the stockpile. So the question put to him was that the clock is ticking on that threat once any ceasefire is reached. So let's put all of this now. There's a lot more to unpick. So let's go now to our correspondent, Rich Preston, who is there for us. So Rich, there is so much to unpack in this speech, but let's start first of all with the big focus, which was just how much more allies are going to have to increase their defence spending by. Because let's get to the bottom of this. 5% that is the goal, but he seemed to be satisfied with where the UK is going, but the UK hasn't, as far as we can see, committed to that 5% figure.
Yeah, that's right. So the Strategic Defence Review came out a few weeks ago, last week even, I think it was, and the UK has pledged to up its defence spending. Now, the figure you often hear bandied about is 2%. Now, that was an agreement that NATO members made 10 or so years ago. But there's pressure now, in particular, let's grab the bull by the horns here, pressure from the United States for NATO allies to spend more on the defence. And the number that gets thrown around now is 5%. And that was the big number that the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte gave in the room there when he said that when NATO allies meet in The Hague in 2 weeks' time for their leaders' summit, that's what he wants them to commit to. 5% of GDP spending on defence. Now that's a big deal. 5% is a big proportion of your budget when you also have to weigh up schools, the health system, your domestic police forces. He did break it down slightly, and he said in particular what NATO wants is 3.5% on core defence spending. Now that's the obvious things: bombs and bullets, ammunition, ships, tanks. The other 1.5% is a touch more vague. He said he wants that to be spent on civilian infrastructure that basically aids a country in a time of war. So, for example, railway networks, roads, factories, making sure that the infrastructure is there. And of course, Mark Rutte is able to give a concrete example. He's able to say, look at Ukraine, look what happened in Ukraine, look at how suddenly and how quickly Ukraine had to move people, civilians, munitions, troops around the country in the face of Russian aggression. And of course, Russia was the big topic of this speech. There was absolutely no shying away from it. He said Russia is outpacing NATO 4-1 when it comes to the production of supplies and its ammunition stocks, and talked about how in 5 years' time Russia is a credible threat and could credibly launch an attack on NATO countries. And he said that's what NATO members need to have at the forefront of their mind. He said there's no shying away from it. We need to be honest with people. That's how we persuade countries to spend their money on defence. Russia is the threat.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rich, because when a question was put to him afterwards, I think it was by our own BBC News, Jonathan Beale, actually, about how we know that, where is that information coming from? That figure of within 3 to 5 years, Russia will be able to use its military force against NATO. He said it's based on what military people are saying around what Russia is doing. So perhaps, you know, some more questions than answers around that. But let's pick up a bit on the key thing, you know, the affordability of it, if you like, because you mentioned that government's having to make tough choices about spending on schools and spending on healthcare. We know that on Wednesday there's going to be the spending review. That's when the government will confirm how it's going to allocate public money, how much is going to be spent on what. How do you think that's going to square with this message, which is defence spending should be up to 5% of GDP?
Well, it's a tough one, and I think one of the ways in which politicians square it with the voting public is the fact that defence does create jobs. I mean, Mark Rutte was in Sheffield earlier on today at a steel factory which the UK government is going to be using as part of its defence strategy. And so defence does create jobs. You look in the United States, for example, you know, massive companies there which produce F-35 fighter jets or guns which, you know, get sent to Ukraine, for example. So that's one way that politicians can square it, but it's also the longer term planning. And Mark Rutte said inside, you know, this post-Berlin Wall coming down idea that we live in this world where there can be peace with Russia, he said that doesn't exist. And that is not going to exist. And he used the phrase that we often hear thrown around in these situations, peace through strength. To be at peace, we must prepare for war.
Yes, I feel like he said it in the starkest way possible in the question and answer session, actually, when someone said, what happens if we don't reach that 5%? And he said, well, if you don't get to that 5% of GDP, learn to speak Russian. So you couldn't really get more direct than that, can you? But the question, I suppose, is will that be enough of a deterrent? Because he was talking about trying to make sure that Russia is never able or willing to commit the same aggression that it has on Ukraine. But I suppose if the previous spending, although, you know, the spending over the past couple of years on GDP by NATO members wasn't enough of a deterrent to stop Putin invading Ukraine, then how will the 5% figure be enough of a deterrent to stop Putin taking such action in the future?
Yeah, of course, and you know, one has to remember that Ukraine is not a NATO member. So this was President Putin arguably dipping his toe in the water and seeing what happened if he struck out at a European country. But Ukraine's not a NATO member, so there wasn't that obligation on other countries for that collective defensive response under Article 5. What Mark Rutte did say is that he wants to transform NATO into a NATO which is stronger, fairer and more lethal. And the message, someone picked up on that around the question of lethality, and he said the message needs to be crystal clear. If Russia strikes NATO, the response, the consequences to that will be serious, and he says he is deadly serious about that. Now, it's worth adding he didn't just talk about Russia. He said Russia is part of what he called this awful foursome, which includes China, North Korea and Iran. And he talked about how these four countries are working together, whether it's supplying each other with troops, munitions, technology, and they're working against NATO, and that NATO has to be fairer, stronger, more lethal, not just to counter Russian aggression in that 3 to 5 years, but to counter threats from all of these four countries.
Rich, there were a couple of things that Mark Rutte wouldn't be pushed into commenting on or answering, which is what the end of the war in Ukraine would look like, whether there'd need to be certain amounts of concessions towards Russia. And he wouldn't comment on the fact that, or a question raised by somebody about how the NATO members would feel about the US threatening the sovereignty of Canada. So he wouldn't comment on that. But what he did say, actually, was he did give credit to US President Donald Trump about breaking the deadlock. He said Mr. Trump broke the deadlock between Ukraine and Russia, which was quite an interesting point, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because there was an audience in the room, but there was also very clearly an audience in Mark Rutte's mind, that audience being the occupant of the Oval Office, because not only did he mention those things you said, which I'll come on to, but he talked about the obligation on other NATO members other than America. He said for too long America has shouldered the burden of this kind of collective defensive responsibility. But he said, you know what, other NATO members have broad shoulders as well, and we can start to play our part. But as you were saying, he did talk about the other issues with America, and he was very diplomatic. And of course, NATO's a military alliance, it's not a political group, and so he has to kind of play a diplomatic line. He said America's relations with Canada are not for him to get into, and that he's sure they can sort things out between themselves. But what he was confident about was that all members are in this together. Now, this comes after Pete Hegseth said just last week, the US Secretary of Defense, that other NATO members couldn't necessarily count on the United States if required in the instance of an attack on a NATO member. Now, that goes against the grain for some people, because this Article 5, this idea that an attack on one is an attack on all, in the entire history of NATO, that's only been invoked once by the United States of America following the 9/11 attack. So for some countries, hearing a US Defense Secretary say that does kind of jar slightly. So when Mark Rutte is making his speech in Chatham House, and when we see him at the NATO summit in The Hague in a couple of weeks' time, it's clear who he's talking to, really. He's talking to the President of the United States, the White House, and his team, saying, no, NATO members will do our bit, and we know that for you, spending more money is an important part of that, and we're going to do it. Now, this is a wish list at the moment for Mark Rutte. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating, and that will be in 2 weeks' time at this summit in The Hague, when Mark Rutte is hoping that these other NATO leaders will commit to that 5% figure.
Our correspondent Rich Preston, thank you very much for your analysis there. And yes, as Rich said, Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, with an eye on his audience being the US and very much getting a message across to them. And understandably, he also had an eye to his host nation as well, it taking place in Downing Street. Of course, he mentioned the bulldog spirit of Winston Churchill. He also made reference to the Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, as well. So let's find out a little bit about what else he said specifically in response to what the UK is doing. So this was before the speech. He said he commended Keir Starmer for the Strategic Defence Review. He said it's really very good stuff. He also said it's not about the traditional things like ammunition. There's also drones and innovation. And he praised the amount that Keir Starmer had done towards that and the Defence Review, which he also mentioned a few times while speaking at Chatham House. Meanwhile, Sir Keir Starmer said, we see NATO as the cornerstone of our defence, the most effective military alliance the world has ever seen, as has been proven over 80 years. And in his speech, Mark Rutte thanked the UK for its commitment to NATO, as he said. Well, let's find out a little bit more about some other reaction to Mark Rutte's speech. Let's hear now from Ed Arnold. He's a senior fellow for the European security at the UK defence think tank RUSI, and he spoke to my colleague Matthew.
I think that was a very open speech, and he also alluded to the fact that he's around other national capitals. So he's obviously on a drive to push what he sort of referred to as his ambition for 3.5%. But I think the real difference now is there's a lot of NATO nations that have already gone past 3.5%. They're sort of not waiting for the lowest common denominator approach because they noticed a threat. So actually the discussion and to get to the agreement this year, it will probably be actually easier than it was in 2014.
Although today it has been revealed that Canada has hit 2% of their NATO defence spending, but only just now. So there is a massive gap. Just that question that Jonathan Beale, BBC's correspondent, put to Mark Rutte. In terms of the timeline on this 5%, he was not specific about when they hope to actually get to that point.
Yes, and the timeline's absolutely critical, and considering he reiterated sort of the NATO assessment that NATO could be at war with Russia by 2030. I mean, if it was then a target that was much later than that date, it'd be quite curious. But I think the issue for NATO and also the Secretary General is keeping nations honest. So Germany, before their Zeitenwende speech in 2022, they were not going to meet the 2% until 2031, until they changed course. So actually keeping nations honest as they move to that, and it might actually have to increase if the threat environment worsens. That's going to be critical also for the Secretary General.
I'll come to some of the other issues he raised in a moment, but on this percentage figure on GDP, it was interesting. I was listening to the German foreign minister at that Brussels gathering last week, and he talked about it being unrealistic in terms of 3.5%, because he said even if you had that amount to spend, you didn't actually have the capacity for the industrial base to deliver those orders, and that is a real problem. And actually Mark Rutte addressing the same thing in a different way.
Yes, and that is an absolute issue that we sort of have been dealing with, particularly over the last 3 years. In some areas, there's very positive news. In some areas, there's not. But actually, this isn't just about ramp up of production. You can have all the tanks and planes you want. If you don't have any soldiers or sailors to go in them, they're useless. And actually, a lot of the money that the UK is uplifting on is going into things like housing. So that is one of the primary reasons why people leave the service in terms of retention issues. So I think that shouldn't really be an issue when they say, well, we can't spend it all. There's a lot of defence related investment, which is really important, which is not just about stockpiling kit and equipment.
The Secretary General also talked about a 400% increase in air and missile defences. Why are we in that position that is the quantity of uplift that is actually required?
Well, air defence was something that was just deprioritised after the Cold War, and effectively it was then quite small, exquisite systems that could protect your military when it was predominantly overseas, such as in Afghanistan. And then also since 2022, one of the main areas which we have been supplying to Ukraine is air defence, because of the Russian capabilities and also their desire to hit civilian infrastructure and also things like Ukraine's power grid. So this is something that NATO has to grapple with immediately, to say, well, actually, it's not just our force in the field that could be targeted, but it's our civilians, it's our infrastructure, and that's why it has to increase at such a level.
Ed, a quick final thought, because we heard questions about how much this is all a result of the push from Donald Trump to get NATO members to spend more. I suppose the thing that underpins all of that is still the NATO concern that when push comes to shove, perhaps the new American president may not be 100% behind NATO. Is that still a worry, do you think?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And in terms of sort of the audiences of the Secretary General's speech, I mean, he had three. When he was talking about stronger, he was talking to the UK government and population. When he was talking about it being fairer, he was certainly talking to the US audience to say, you know, we've got it this time. We are increasing, you know, we are going to make this burden sharing better in terms of the Euro-Atlantic. And then finally, in terms of more lethal, that was certainly targeted against Russia. So I think, yeah, the desire from Donald Trump for the Europeans to spend more certainly will loom large at the Hague summit in 2 weeks' time.
That was Ed Arnold from the UK defence think tank RUSI speaking to my colleague Matthew earlier. And one of the points he mentioned near the beginning was the fact that Mr Rutte didn't mention any sort of deadline, so we don't know when nations are expected to build up to this 5% of GDP on defence spending. Let me just bring you the quote from his speech, or from when he spoke to reporters on that. So Mr Rutte said, in response to being asked a question about the deadline, he said, "I have a clear view on when we should achieve that. I keep that to myself because we are having these consultations now with allies and these discussions are ongoing, and we will, in the end, agree on a date when we have to be there." So I suppose he's saying just watch this space. Well, let's just pick up again on some of the key points that came from that speech, which had really strong words from NATO Chief Mark Rutte. He said that a quantum leap in defence spending is needed from NATO allies. And he said to prepare for peace, we must prepare for war. And he said that the key threat is from Russia, first and foremost, but also China, North Korea and Iran. And he named them the awful foursome. And he said that Russia is producing more weapons and faster than we thought, and said that it could be ready to use military force against NATO in 3 to 5 years. And when pressed on where he got that information or what that's based on, he said it's based on what military people are saying that Russia is doing. Let's have a listen now to some of the key points from the speech that Mark Rutte made a little bit earlier.
History has taught us that to preserve peace, we must prepare for war. Wishful thinking will not keep us safe. We cannot dream away the danger. Hope is not a strategy. So NATO has to become a stronger, fairer and more lethal alliance. A stronger NATO means spending much more on our defence. All allies will reach the initial target of spending 2% of GDP on defence this year. That was a pledge made way back in 2014. Now we have a concrete plan for the future. We know what we need, and we know what to do. At the summit in The Hague, I expect allied leaders will agree to spend 5% of GDP on defence. It will be a NATO-wide commitment and a defining moment for the alliance. There are two parts to this new defence spending plan. 3.5% will be invested in our core military requirements, while the rest will go towards defence and security-related investments, including infrastructure and building industrial capacity. 5% is not some figure plucked from the air. It's grounded in hard facts. The fact is, we need a quantum leap in our collective defence. The fact is, we must have more forces and capabilities to implement our defence plans in full. The fact is, danger will not disappear, even when the war in Ukraine ends. Our decisions on defence spending are driven by NATO's battle plans and capability targets. They define what forces and capabilities allies need to provide. And last week, NATO defence ministers agreed ambitious new targets. The exact details are classified, but we need a 400% increase in air and missile defense. We see in Ukraine how Russia delivers terror from above. So we will strengthen the shield that protects our skies. Our militaries also need thousands more armored vehicles and tanks, millions more artillery shells. And we must double our enabling capabilities, such as logistics, supply, transportation and medical support. Allies will invest in more warships and aircraft. To give just one example, America's allies will procure at least 700 F-35 fighter jets in total. We will also invest in more drones and long-range missile systems, and invest more in space and cyber capabilities. It is clear, if we do not invest more, our collective defense is not credible. Spending more is not about pleasing an audience of one. It is about protecting 1 billion people. Allies will also make broader defense and security-related investments, including infrastructure. Roads, rail and ports are just as important as tanks, fighters and warships. We need civilian transport networks that can support military mobility, to get the right forces to the right place at the right time. The home front and the front line are now one and the same. War is no longer fought at a distance. Our societies and militaries are in this together. We will invest more in civil preparedness, so our societies are ready for the day we pray will never come. And NATO works 24/7 to ensure that day never arrives. We will also spend more to protect our societies against cyber attacks, sabotage and other threats. And broader defense and security-related investments should include financing and capital improvements to our defense industrial base. It is clear that right across the alliance, we are not producing enough. So as we increase defense investment, we need to increase defense production. More demand means increasing supply, not higher prices. And it also means ensuring that the alliance can produce at scale and at speed. We need raw industrial capacity, like Sheffield Forge Masters, which I visited this morning with Defense Secretary John Healey. We need cheaper electricity, access to critical minerals, and more engineering know-how. Otherwise, the commitment to spend 5% of GDP on defense will be lost to production costs rather than invested in defense. So we will enhance and expand the industrial base right across the alliance. We will support increased defense production, remove barriers to cooperation, and harness cutting-edge technologies.
That was NATO Chief Mark Rutte saying in a nutshell, NATO countries need to increase their defence spending to 5% of their GDP to protect against the threat of military aggression from Russia, mainly. He said the US has done more than their fair share and other NATO countries need to pick up the burden to share that more fairly. Of course, this all comes at a cost, and it's interesting that in a couple of days we're going to have the spending review where the government's going to confirm how much public money will be allocated to which different things. You can get more on that aspect ahead of Wednesday on the BBC News website and the app. And of course, there's more on the defence review. That is with details on what the UK is planning to increase its spending on in terms of different elements of defence. So that's all on the BBC News website. But for now, thanks for being with us here on BBC News.